Hello, and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory, and if you've never been here before, quick things up front. What we do is we read old folktales and fairy tales from the past, although in the case of Halloween, we just kind of read spooky tales from the past. And then, on top of that, if you are new here and you're not watching this live, and you just want to get to the beginnings of the stories, check in the description below. There'll be a little timestamp, take you to the beginning of the story. We're going to read two stories tonight, and they are both from the same author. They are from a gentleman. Sorry. Feels a little loud. I got myself distracted. I'm going to turn the music down here a bit. There we go. Sorry, it's from a gentleman named William Hope Hodgson. William Hope Hodgson wrote before Lovecraft. Well, before Lovecraft, but just barely. Like, he was somewhat alongside Lovecraft. We're going to read stories that come from, like, the early 20s. And Lovecraft's was writing at that point, but, like, the main body of his work was like in the 30s, well, late 20s, 30s kind of thing. Actually, I think he kind of disappeared in the 30s, and then he had a little bit of popularity in the 40s, and then he, like so many authors, just died. Nobody really knew him in his life. But the reason why I bring up Lovecraft is because what you'll see is an almost certain influence on Lovecraft from this work. William Hope Hodgson wrote a whole bunch of different stuff, all sort of in the weird fiction genre, which is sort of a late Victorian era, early turn of the century term for sci-fi and horror and kind of everything that we sort of split out and atomized now. So for example, he had a book that was kind of a series that was kind of like Sherlock, but debunking, it was like Ghost Detective or something, but like debunking it. So like, I don't know. He's got an interesting history of writing. We're going to read some short stories from probably the thing he's most known for, which is nautical tales of creepy terrors and ghosts and things like that. And I've picked two stories that I think have an obvious influence on two of the most popular pieces of Lovecraft's works. Specifically, of course, Call of Cthulhu and The Mouth of Innisfree. Is that what it's called? No, I'm mixing it up with The Lake Isle of Innisfree, which is a poem from Yeats. What is the name of the Fishtown one? I've completely lost track of my Lovecraft Fishtown name, but the work, I've read it, the work where people are, spoiler alert, turning into fish. We're going to see pieces that I think have obvious influence on that here. Yeah, for the most part, though, we're just reading creepy stories because it's fun to read them. I see GS is in the chat. Hello, GS. Says, good evening, love the art for this one. Yeah, I want to give credit. Like, it's not like I read through 10,000 books and then I just have a working encyclopedic knowledge of these things. I rely a lot on people who write, to various blog posts and articles on sort of lesser known pieces, and then I sort of curate from there. And the one that I'm going to highlight is that where I found this art, I'm assuming it comes from them because every source I could find for it came from them, is from Old Style Tales Press. Old Style, spelled OLDSTYLE. And they, you can go to oldstyletales.com and they have a little classic horror blog there that I'm indebted to for this show. They sort of guided me through some of Hodgson's stuff when I was trying to find out about it. Okay, that's enough blibbity blab from me. We are going to start our night with the Demons of the Sea. Well, actually, and I'm going to take the fireplace sound down a bit, because we are going to do a different sound. This story is called Demons of the Sea. It's a short nautical horror story from William Hope Hodgson. And let's set the mood here. Let me know if that's sea sound is too loud. Oh, one thing. In classic Lovecraft fashion, there is some arbitrary racism in this. And I've made the call to simply exclude it from my reading, but include it in the visual component. So if you're so interested in what he originally wrote, it'll be the crossed out sections. Demons of the Sea. Come out on the deck and have a look, Danny, Yepson cried, rushing into the half deck. The old man says there's been a submarine earthquake and the sea's all bubbling and muddy. Obeying the summons of Yespin's excited tone, I followed him out. It was as he said. The everlasting blue of the ocean was now mottled with splotches of a muddy hue, and at times a large bubble would appear to burst with a loud pop. Aft, the skipper and the three mates could be seen on the poop deck, which, by the way, has nothing to do with poop. It's like the captain's deck. It's where they steer the ship from. Peering at the sea through their glasses. As I gazed out over the gently heaving water, far off to windward, something was hove up into the evening air. It appeared to be a mass of seaweed, but fell back into the water with a sullen plunge, as though it were something more substantial. Immediately after this strange occurrence, the sun set with tropical swiftness, and in the brief afterglow things assumed a rather strange unreality. The crew were all below, no one but the mate and the helmsman remaining on the poop. Away forward on the top gallant forecastle head, the dim figure of the man on lookout could be seen, leaning against the forestay. No sound was heard, save the occasional jingle of a chain sheet or the flog of the steering gear as a small swell passed under our counter. Presently the mate's voice broke the silence, and looking up, I saw that the old man had come on deck, and I was walking with him. Well, you can't hear any music or waves, eh? Well, let's turn that up a bit. Certainly should be able to hear music. It's showing as hot. Turned it up a bit, hopefully that helps. Oh, no music. Well, I can turn the music up a bit. I'll start from the beginning of this paragraph. The crew were all below, no one but the mate and the helmsman remaining on the poop. Away forward on the top gallant forecastle head, the dim figure of the man on lookout could be seen, leaning against the forestay. No sound was heard save the occasional jingle of the chain sheet or the flog of the steering gear as a small swell passed under our counter. Presently, the mate's voice broke the silence, and looking up, I saw that the old man had come on deck and was talking with him. From the few stray words that could be overheard, I knew they were talking of the strange happenings of the day. Shortly after sunset, the wind, which had been fresh during the day, died down, and with its passing air grew oppressively hot. Not long after 2 bells, the mate sung out for me. When I had carried out his instructions, he placed a thermometer in the bucket. Oh, and ordered me to fill a bucket from overside and bring it to him. When I had carried out his instructions, he placed a thermometer in the bucket. "Just as I thought," he muttered, removing the instrument and showing it to the skipper. 99 degrees. Why, the sea's hot enough to make tea with. Hope it doesn't get any hotter, growled the latter. If it does, we shall all be boiled alive. At a sign from the mate, I emptied the bucket and replaced it in the rack, after which I resumed my former position by the rail. The old man and the mate walked the poop side by side. The air grew hotter as the hours passed, and after a long period of silence, broken only by the occasional pop of a bursting gas bubble, the moon arose. It shed but a feeble light, however, as a heavy mist had arisen from the sea, and through this the moonbeams struggled weakly. The mist, we decided, was due to the excessive heat of the seawater, as it was a very wet mist, and we were soon soaked to the skin. Slowly the interminable night wore on, and the sun arose, looking dim and ghostly through the mists that rolled and billowed about the ship. From time to time we took the temperature of the sea, and although we found but a slight increase therein, no work was done, and a feeling as if something impending pervaded the ship. The foghorn was kept going constantly, as the lookout peered through the wreathing mists. The captain walked the poop in company with the mates, and once the third mate spoke and pointed out into the clouds of fogs, all eyes followed his gesture, and we saw what was apparently a black line which seemed to cut the whiteness of the billows. It reminded us of nothing so much as an enormous cobra standing on its tail. As we looked, it vanished. The grouped mates were evidently puzzled, and there seemed to be a difference of opinion among them. Presently, as they argued, I heard the second mate's voice. "That's all right," he said. "I've seen things in the fog before, but they've always turned out to be imaginary." Third shook his head and made some reply I could not overhear, but no further comment was made. Going below that afternoon, I got a short sleep, and on coming on deck at 8 bells, I found that the stream still held us. If anything, it seemed to be thicker than ever. Hansard, who had been taking the temperatures during my watch below, informed me that the sea was 3 degrees hotter, and that the old man was getting into an rare old state. At 3 bells, I went forward to have a look over the bows, and a chin with the Stevenson, whose lookout it was Stevenson, sorry. On gaining the forecastle head, I went to the side and looked down into the water. Stevenson came over and stood beside me. "Rum go, this," he grumbled. He stood by my side for a time in silence. We seemed to be hypnotized by the gleaming surface of the sea. Suddenly, out of the depths, right before us, there arose a monstrous black face. It was like a frightful caricature of a human countenance. For a moment we gazed petrified. My blood seemed to suddenly turn to ice water. I was unable to move. And with a mighty effort of will, I regained my self-control, and grasping Stevenson's arm, I found what I could do no more than croak. My powers of speech seemed gone. "Look!" I gasped. "Look!" Stevenson continued to stare into the sea like a man turned to stone. He seemed to stoop further over, as if to examine the thing more closely. "Lord," he exclaimed, "it must be the devil himself!" As though the sound of his voice had broken a spell, the thing disappeared. My companion looked at me while I rubbed my eyes. thinking that I'd been asleep, that the awful vision had been a frightful nightmare. One look at my friend, however, disabused me of any such thought. His face wore a puzzled expression. "Better go aft and tell the old man," he faltered. I nodded and left the forecastle head, making my way aft like one in a trance. The skipper and the mate were standing at the break of the poop, and running up the ladder, I told them what we had seen. "Bosh!" sneered the old man. "You've been looking at your own ugly reflection in the water." Nevertheless, in spite of his ridicule, he questioned me closely, and finally he ordered the mate forward to see if he could see anything. The latter, however, returned in a few moments to report that nothing unusual could be seen. Wow. Four bells were struck, and we were relieved for tea. Coming on deck afterward, I found the men clustered forward. The sole topic of conversation with them was the thing that Stevenson and I had seen. Oop. I suppose, Danny, it couldn't have been a reflection by any chance, could it?" one of the older men asked. "Ask Stevenson, I replied, as I made my way aft. At 8 bells, my watch came on deck again to find that nothing further had developed. But about an hour before midnight, the mate, thinking to have a smoke, sent me to his room for a box of matches with which to light his pipe. It took me no time to clatter down the brass-treaded ladder and back to the poop, where I handed him the desired article. Taking the box, he removed a match and struck it on the heel of his boot. As he did so, far out in the night, a muffled screaming arose. Then came a clamor as of a horse braying, like an ass but considerably deeper, and with a horribly suggestive human note running through it. "Good God! Did you hear that, Danny?" asked the mate in odd tones. "Yes, sir," I replied, listening and scarcely noticing his question, for a repetition of the strange sounds. Suddenly the frightful bellowing broke out afresh, and the mate's pipe fell to the deck with a clatter. "Run forward," he cried. "Quick now, and see if you could see anything." And with my heart in my mouth and my pulse pounding madly, I raced forward. The watch were all up on the forecastle head, clustered around the lookout. Each man was talking and gesticulating wildly. And then they became silent and turned questioning glances towards me as I shouldered my way among them. "Have you seen anything?" I cried. Before I could receive an answer, a repetition of the horrible sounds broke out, profaning the night with their horror. They seemed to have definite direction now, in spite of the fog that enveloped us. Undoubtedly, too, they were nearer. Pausing a moment to make sure of their bearing, I hastened aft and reported to the mate. I told him that nothing could be seen, but that the sounds apparently came from right ahead of us. On hearing this, he ordered the man at the wheel to let the ship's head come off a couple of points. A moment later, a shrill screaming tore its way through the night, followed by the hoarse braying sounds once more. "It's close on the starboard bow!" exclaimed the mate, as he beckoned the helmsman to let her head come off a little more. Then, singing out for the watch, he ran forward, slacking the lee braces on the way. When he had the yards trimmed to his satisfaction on the new course, he returned to the poop and hung far out over the rail, listening intently. Moments passed that seemed like hours, yet the silence, it remained unbroken. Suddenly, the sounds began again, and so close that it seemed as though they must be right aboard us. At this time, I noticed a strange, booming note mingled with the brays, and once or twice there came a sound that can only be described as a sort of gaw, gaw. Then would come a wheezing whistling for all the world, like an asthmatic person breathing. All this while the moon shone wanly through the steam, which seemed to me to be somewhat thinner. Once the mate gripped me by the shoulder as the noises rose and fell again. They now seemed to be coming from a point broad on our beam. Every eye on the ship was straining into the mist, but with no result. Suddenly one of the men cried out as something long and black slid past us into the fog astern. From it there rose 4 indistinct and ghostly towers, which resolved themselves into spars and ropes and sails. "A ship! It's a ship!" we cried excitedly. I turned to Mr. Gray. He too had seen something and was staring aft into the wake. So ghost-like, unreal, and fleeting had been our glimpse of the stranger that we were not sure that we had seen an honest, material ship, but thought that we had vouchsafed a vision of a phantom vessel like the Flying Dutchman. Our sails gave a sudden flap, and the clew's iron flogging the bulwarks with hollow thumps. The mates glanced aloft. "Wind's dropping," he growled savagely. "We'll never get out of this infernal place at this gate." Gradually the wind fell until it was a flat calm. No sound broke the death-like silence save for the rapid patter of the reef points. As he gently rose and fell on the light swell, hours passed, and the watch was relieved, and I then went below. At 7 bells we were called again. And as I went along the deck to the galley, I noticed that the fog seemed thinner and the air cooler. When 8 bells were struck, I relieved Hansard at coiling down the ropes. From him I learned that the steam had begun to clear about 4 bells, and that the temperature of the sea had fallen 10 degrees. In spite of the thinning mist, it was not until about a half an hour later that we were able to get a glimpse of the surrounding sea. It was still mottled with dark patches, but with the bubbling and popping had ceased, as much of the surface of the ocean as could be seen had a peculiarly desolate aspect. Occasionally, a wisp of steam would float up from the nearer sea and roll undulating across its silent surface until lost in the vagueness that still held the hidden horizon. Here and there, columns of steam rose up in pillars, which gave me the impression that the sea was hot in patches. Crossing to the starboard side and looking over, I found that conditions were similar to those to the port. The desolate aspect of the sea filled me with an idea of chilliness, although the air was quite warm and muggy. From the break of the poop, the mate called to me to get his glasses, and when I had done so, he took them from me, looking glasses, and walked to the taffrail. Here he stood for some moments polishing them with his handkerchief, and after a moment he raised them to his eyes, and he peered long and intently into the mist and astern. I stood for some time staring at the point at which the mate had focused his glasses. Presently something shadowy grew upon my vision. Steadily watching it, I distinctly saw the outlines of a ship take form in the fog. "See!" I cried, but even as I spoke, the lifting wraith of mist disclosed to view a great 4-masted bark lying becalmed with all sails set. within a few hundred yards of our stern, as though a curtain had been raised and then allowed to fall. The fog once more settled down, hiding the strange bark from our sight, and the mate was all excitement, striding with quick, jerky steps up and down the poop, stopping every few moments to peer through his glasses at the point where the foremaster had disappeared in the fog. Gradually, as the mist dispersed again, the vessel could be seen more plainly, and it was then that the cause of the dreadful noises during the night could be seen. For some time the mate watched her silently, and as he watched, the conviction grew upon me that in spite of the mist, I could detect some sort of movement on board of her. After some time had passed, the doubt became a certainty, and I could see us sort of splashing in the water alongside her. Suddenly the mate put his glasses on top of the wheel box and told me to bring the speaking trumpet. Running to the companionway, I secured the trumpet and was back at his side. The mate raised it to his lips and, taking a deep breath, sent a hail across the water that should have awakened the dead. We waited tensely for a reply, and a moment later, a deep, hollow mutter came from the bark. Higher and louder it swelled until we realized that we were listening to the same sounds we'd heard the night before. The mate stood aghast at this answer to his hail. In a voice barely more than a hushed whisper, he bade, Call the old man." Attracted by the mate's hail and its unearthly reply, the watch had all come aft and were clustered in the mizzen rigging in order to see better. After calling the captain, I returned to the poop, where I found the second and third mates talking with the chief. All were engaged in trying to pierce the clouds of mist that half hid our strange consort, and to arrive at some explanation of the strange phenomena for the past few hours. A moment later, the captain appeared carrying his telescope. The mate gave him a brief account of the state of affairs and handed him the trumpet. Giving me the telescope to hold, the captain hailed the shadowy bark. Breathlessly, we all listened, and when again, in answer to the old man's hail, the frightful sounds rose on the still morning air, the skipper lowered the trumpet and stood with an expression of astonished horror on his face. "Lord!" he exclaimed, "what an ungodly row!" At this, the third, who'd been gazing through his binoculars, broke the silence. "Look!" he ejaculated, "there's a breeze coming up astern," and at his words, the captain looked up quickly, and we all watched the ruffling water. "That packet yonder is bringing breezes with her. She'll be alongside in a half an hour." Some moments passed, and the bank of fog had come to within 100 yards of our taffrail. The strange vessel could be distinctly seen from just inside the fringe of the driving mist wreaths. After a short puff, the wind died completely. But as we stared with hypnotic fascination, the water astern of the stranger ruffled again with a fresh cat's paw. Seemingly with the flapping of her sails, she drew slowly up to us. As the leaden seconds passed, the big foremaster approached us steadily. The light air had now reached us. With a lazy lift of our sails, we too began to forge slowly through that weird sea. The bark was now within 50 yards of our stern, and she was steadily drawing nearer, seeming to be able to outfoot us with ease. She came on, she luffed sharply, and came up into the wind with her weather leeches shaking. I looked toward her poop, and thinking to discern the figure of a man at the wheel, but the mist coiled around her quarter, and objects on the after end of her became indistinguishable. With a rattle of chain sheets at her iron yard, she filed away again. We meanwhile had gone ahead, but it was soon evident that she was the better sailor. For she came up to us, hand over fist. The wind rapidly freshened, and the mist began to drift away before it, so that each moment her spars and cordage became more plainly visible. The skipper and the mates were watching her intently, as when an almost simultaneous exclamation of fear broke from them. "My God!" And well they might show signs of fear, for crawling about the bark's deck were the most horrible creatures I had ever seen. In spite of their unearthly strangeness, there was something vaguely familiar about them. Then it came to me that the face that Stevenson and I had seen during the night had belonged to one of them. Their bodies had something of the shape of a seal's, but of a dead, unhealthy white. The lower part of their body ended in a sort of double-curved tail, on which they appeared to be able to shuffle about. And in place of arms, they had two long, snaky feelers, at the ends of which were very human-like hands, which were equipped with talons instead of nails. Fearsome indeed were these parodies of human beings. Their faces, which were like their tentacles were black, were the most grotesquely human things about them. And the upper jaw closed into the lower, after the manners of the jaws of an octopus. "What devilish beast!" burst out the captain in disgust. With his remark, he turned to the mates, and as he did so, the expressions on their face told me that they had all realized that the presence of these bestial-looking brutes meant, if as was and doubtless the case, these creatures had boarded the bark and destroyed her crew, what would prevent them from doing the same with us? We were a smaller ship, and had a smaller crew, and more I thought of it, the less I liked it. We could now see that the bark's bow, with the naked eye, it read Scottish Heath, while on her boats we could see the name bracketed with Glasgow, showing that she hailed from that port. It was a remarkable coincidence that she should have a slant from just the quarter in which yards were trimmed, as before we saw her she must have been drifting around with everything aback. But now in this light air she was able to run alongside us with no one at her helm. But steering herself she was, and although at times she yawed widely, she never got herself aback. As we gazed at her, we noticed the sudden movement on board of her, and several of the creatures slid into the water. "See, see! They've spotted us! They're coming for us!" cried the mate wildly. It was only too true. Scores of them were sliding into the sea, letting themselves down by means of their long tentacles. On they came, slipping by scores and hundreds into the water, swimming towards us in droves. The ship was making about 3 knots. Otherwise they would have caught us in a very few minutes. But they persevered, gaining slowly but surely, and drawing nearer and nearer. The long, tentacled arms rose out of the sea in hundreds, and the foremost ones were already within a score of yards of the ship before the old man bethought to himself to shout to the mates to fetch up the 6 cutlasses that comprised the ship's armory. And then turning to me, he ordered me to go down to his cabin and bring up the 2 revolvers out of the top drawer of the chart table. Also a box of cartridges were there. When I returned with the weapons, he loaded them and handed one to the mate. Meanwhile, the pursuing creatures were coming steadily nearer, and soon 6 of the leaders were directly under our counter. Immediately, the captain leaned over the rail and emptied his pistol into them, but without any apparent effect. He must have realized how puny and ineffectual his efforts were, for he did not reload his weapon. Some dozens of the brutes reached us, and as they did so, their tentacles rose into the air and caught... Pardon me. And caught our rail. I heard the 3rd mate scream suddenly, and turning, I saw him dragged quickly to the rail with a tentacle wrapped around him, snatching a cutlass. The second mate hacked off the tentacle where it joined the body. A gout of blood splashed into the third mate's face, and he fell to the deck. A dozen more of those arms rose and wavered in the air, but as now they seemed some more yards astern of us. A rapidly widening patch of clearer water appeared between us and foremost of our pursuers, and we raised a shout of wild joy. The cause was soon apparent, for a fine fair wind had sprung up, and with the increase in its force, the Scottish heath had got herself aback. And while we were rapidly leaving the monsters behind us, the third mate rose to his feet with a dazed look, and as he did so, something fell to the deck. I picked up and found that it was the severed portion of the tentacle of the third's late adversary. With a grimace of disgust, I tossed it into the sea, and as I needed no reminder of that awful experience. 3 weeks later, we were anchored in San Francisco. There, the captain made a full report of the affair to the authorities, with the result that a gunboat was dispatched to investigate. 6 weeks later, she returned to report that she'd been unable to find any signs, either of the ship herself or the fearful creatures that had attacked her. And since then, nothing, as far as I know, has ever been heard of the four-masted bark, Scottish Heath, last seen by us in the possession of creatures that might rightly be called demons of the sea. Whether she still floats, occupied by her hellish crew, or whether some storm has sent her last resting place beneath the waves is surely a matter of conjecture. Perchance on some dark, fog-bound night, a ship in that wilderness of waters may hear cries and sounds beyond those of the wailing of the winds. Then let them look to it, for it may be that the demons of the sea are near them. GS says, it's funny because I think I just finished watching John Carpenter's The Fog about supernatural beings being from the sea. Is that what that's about? Like, I knew it was about the fog and like stuff came in the fog and attacked. I didn't know they came from the sea. I've never actually seen it. I know I'm supposed to have, but me thinks John C. may have read this tale. It's very possible. GS says smoky? I'm not sure what you mean. Like, why couldn't they see? Wow, that story took longer to read than I thought it would. This one's shorter. It's about half the length, so this should take us cleanly to an hour. Hopefully the audio is all still good. Obviously doing, a little extra sound effects and stuff puts a competition in for the voice. So hopefully you guys were able to hear all that. This story is also from William Hope Hodgson. GS says, no, is smoke bothering your throat? Yes, absolutely. Is that coming through? If you don't know, up here in Vancouver, we're getting a lot of forest fire smoke because the true horror of the season is that it's as hot as August and we're getting wildfires in October. Anyways. William Hope Hodgson also wrote this story. It's a shorter story called Out of the Storm. Now, I think if I want to give a frame to this is sort of a take, I would say, on an Edgar Allan Poe shtick. Edgar Allan Poe had this thing about, like, first-person terrible deaths. Like, there's his most famous one, I think, is about being buried alive. And I would say that this is a take on that by the same guy who wrote the last story, who, by the way, was a sailor for a lot of his life, and I think that's why. So this is Out of the Storm by William Hope Hodgson, a short story about dying. "Hush!" said my friend the scientist, as I walked into his laboratory. I'd opened my lips to speak, but stood silent for a few minutes at his request. He was sitting at his instrument, and the thing was tapping out a message in a curiously irregular fashion, stopping a few seconds and then going on at a furious pace. It was during a somewhat longer than usual pause that, growing slightly impatient, I ventured to address him. "Anything important?" I asked. "For God's sake, shut up!" he answered back in a high, strained voice. I stared. I am used to pretty abrupt treatment from him at times, and when he is much engrossed in some particular experiment. But this was going a little too far, and I said so. He was writing, and for reply he pushed several loosely written sheets over to me with one curt word: "Read." With a sense of half of anger and half of curiosity, I picked up the first and glanced at it. After a few lines, I was gripped and held securely by a morbid interest. I was reading a message from one in the last extremity, and I will give it word for word. Just gonna have a drink of water. I was reading a message from one in the last extremity, and I will give it word for word. "John, we are sinking. I wonder if you really understand what I feel at the present time. You sitting comfortably in your laboratory, and I out here upon the waters, already one among the dead. Yes, we are doomed. There is no such thing as help in our case. We are sinking steadily, remorselessly. God, I must keep up and be a man. I need not tell you that I am in the operator's room, all the rest on deck are dead, and the hungry thing which is smashing the ship to pieces. I do not know where we are, and there is no one of whom I can ask. The last of the officers was drowned nearly an hour ago, and the vessel is now little more than sort of a breakwater for the giant seas. Once, about a half an hour ago, I went out onto the deck. My God, the sight was terrible. It is a little after midday, but the sky is the color of mud. Do you understand? Gray mud! Down from it there hang vast lappets of clouds, not such clouds as I've ever seen before, but monstrous, mildewed-looking halls. They show solid, save where the frightful wind tears their lower edges into the great feelers that swirl savagely above us like the tentacles of some enormous horror. Such a sight is difficult to describe to the living, though the dead of the sea know of it without words of mine. It is such a sight that none is allowed to see it alive. It is a picture for the doomed and the dead. One of the sea's hell orgies, One of the thing's monstrous gloatings over the living, say the alive and death, those upon the brink. I have no right to tell of it to you. To speak of it to one of the living is to initiate innocence into one of the infernal mysteries. To talk of foul things to a child, yet I care not. I will expose in all its hideous nakedness the death side of the sea. The undoomed living shall know some of the things that death has hitherto so well guarded. Death knows not of this little instrument beneath my hands that connects me still with the quick, else would he haste to quiet me. Hark you, John, I have learnt undreamt things in this little time of waiting. I know now why we are afraid of the dark. I never imagined such secrets of the sea and the grave, which are one and the same. Listen! But I was forgetting. You cannot hear, I can. The sea is hushed. The sea is laughing, as though hell cackled from the mouth of an ass. It is jeering, and I can hear its voice echo like satanic thunder amid the mud overhead. It is calling to me, call, I must go, the sea calls. O God, art thou indeed God? Canst thou sit above and watch calmly which I have just seen? Nay, thou art no God. Thou art weak and puny beside this foul thing which thou didst create in thy lusty youth. It is now God, and I am one of its children. Are you there, John? Why don't you answer me? Listen, I ignore God, for there is a stronger than he. My God is here, beside me, around me, and will be soon above me. You know what that means. It is merciless. The sea is now all the God there is. That is one of the things I have learnt. Listen, it is laughing again. God is it, not he. It called, and I went out onto the decks. All was terrible. It is in the waste everywhere. It has swamped the ship. Only the forecastle, bridge, and poop stick up out from the bestial, reeking thing. Like 3 islands in the midst of shrieking foam. At times, gigantic billows assail the ship from both sides. They form momentary arches above the vessel, arches of dull, curved water 100 feet toward the hideous sky, and then they descend roaring. Think of it! You cannot. There is an infection of sin in the air. It is the exhalations from the thing, those left upon the drenched islets of shattered wood and iron, doing the most horrible things. The thing is teaching them. Later I felt the vial informing of its breath, but I have fled back here to pray for death. On the forecastle I saw a mother and her little son clinging to an iron rail. A great billow heaved up above them, descended in a falling mountain of brine. It passed, and as they were still there, the thing was only toying with them. Yet all the same it had torn the hands of the child from the rail, and the child was clinging frantically to its mother's arm. I saw another vast hill hurl up to port and hover above them, and then the mother stooped a bit like a foul beast at the hands of her wee son. She was afraid that this little additional weight would be more than she could hold. I heard his scream even where I stood. It drove me upon that wild laughter. It told me that God is not he, but it. Then the hill thundered down upon those two. It seemed to me that the thing gave a bellow as it leapt. It roared about them, churning and growling, then surged away. And there was only one, the mother. There appeared to me to be blood as well as water upon her face, especially about her mouth. But the distance was too great, and I cannot be sure. I looked away. Close to me I saw something further. A beautiful young girl, her soul hideous with the breath of the thing. Struggling with her sweetheart for the shelter of the chart house side, he threw her off, and she came back at him, and I saw her hand come from her head, where still clung the wreckage of some form of headgear. She struck at him, and he shouted and fell away to leeward, and she smiled, showing her teeth. So much for that. I turned elsewhere. Out upon the thing I saw gleams, horrid and suggestive, below the crests of the wave. I've never seen them until this time. I saw a rough sailorman washed away from the vessel. One of the huge breakers snapped at him. Those things were teeth. It has teeth. I heard them clash. I heard his yell. It was no more than a mosquito shrilling amid all that laughter, but it was very terrible. There is worse than death. The ship is lurching very queerly with a sort of sickening heave. I fancy I've been asleep. No, I remember now. I hit my head when she rolled so strangely. My leg is doubled under me. I think it is broken, but it does not matter. I have been praying. What was it? I feel calmer, more resigned now. I think I have been mad. What was it I was saying? I cannot remember. It was something about God. I believe I blasphemed. May he forgive me. Thou knowest, God, that I was not in my right mind. Thou knowest that I am very weak. Be with me in the coming time. I have sinned, but thou art all merciful. Are you there, John? It is very near the end now. I had so much to say, but it all slips from me. What was it that I said? I take it all back. I was mad, and God knows. He is merciful, and I have very little pain now. I feel a bit drowsy. I wonder whether you are there, John. Perhaps, after all, no one has heard the things I've said. It is better so. The living are not meant, and yet I do not know. If you are there, John, you will tell her how it was, but not hark. There was such a thunder of water overhead just then. I fancy two vast seas have met in midair across the top of the bridge and burst all over the vessel. It must be soon now. There were such a number of things I had to say. I can hear voices in the wind. They are singing, and it is like an enormous dirge. I think I have been dozing again. I pray God humbly that it be soon. You will not tell her anything about it, from what I have said, will you, John? I mean, those things I ought not to have said. What was it I did say? My head is growing strangely confused. I wonder whether you really do hear me. I may be talking only to that vast roar outside. Still, it is some comfort to go on. And I will not believe that you do not hear all I say. Hark again! A mountain of brine must have swept clean over the vessel. She is back again. It will be very soon. Are you there, John? Are you there? It is coming. The sea has come for me. It is rushing down through the companionway. It is like a vast jet. My God, I am drowning. I am drowning. There we go. Done with all the Victorian melodrama I can muster. GS says that is chilling. Good reading, Rory. You know, the first time I read it, I missed that they were doing, what do you call it? Morse to each other. Like, I missed that aspect of it, which I guess would have been pretty mind-blowing at the time, that you could, like, hear live something really happening, rather than hearing stories about it later. And so I thought, like, how did he get this letter? Like, at the whole time I was reading it, I was like, how did he get this letter? But that's just because I'm an idiot. All right. Well, there you go. There's your Victorian melodrama. Well, not Victorian, but I think it reads kind of in that Victorian style. For your Halloween, pre-Halloween evening. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. If you enjoy the channel, remember to, in order of importance, let other people know about it. See if you think somebody would like this, send it on to them. That's easily the most valuable thing you can do. You can also like and subscribe, because the algorithm is what it is. And then finally, if you really like it, and you've been watching for a while and you have the means, I have a little donation link where you can send me a couple of bucks for a coffee to help offset, well, not coffee costs. There are actual costs to this stream. But you don't have to do that. It's just an option. And remember that no Big Van Book Club this week. So Wednesday, you're on your own. But Thursday, we'll be back at 6:30 with the Varietal Show, where we'll do some horror writing of our own with the chat, which is a silly and fun thing where we try to have fun with writing rather than take it so seriously and lock ourselves away in a room. Beyond that, GS, thank you for keeping me company. I can't believe I thought this was going to be a short one. I clearly misjudged the length of those stories. I'll keep the fire going. You guys get a good sleep. And don't get too scared.